Hey everyone, it's Sid, and welcome back for the 6th episode of the interview by the Nordic Model, the podcast where we talk about social democratic policy positions, theory, and events of interest. This week I'm going to be talking to SocialismDoneLeft. He's a prominent YouTuber that talks about socialism and progressivism. We're going to be sitting down to talk about wealth taxes, specifically what they are, what's the best collection mechanism for them, and whether they're efficient or not. I'm particularly excited about this episode since wealth taxation seems to now be gaining a lot of traction in current political discourse. So people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were pushing for wealth taxation in the 2020 Democratic primaries. Thomas Piketty, author of Capital in the 21st Century, pushed for a wealth tax as a mechanism of action against the growing inequality that we see in the world. Wealth taxes have been implemented with varying success across European countries. So this is going to be a really interesting dive into them with someone I consider to be an extremely intelligent and perceptive leftist content creator. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of the interview. All right, Mr. SocialismDoneLeft, I'm very excited to have you here on the interview. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. A little bit rushed because of traffic on the way home, but happy to be here.
Yeah, it's that Texas traffic. What can you do? So anyway, yeah,
Democrat-run cities.
Yeah, honestly, they're just screwing everything up. Anyway, I just we've got an hour, so I want to make this as dense and as informative as possible. So one of the things we're gonna be talking about today is wealth taxation. And so wealth taxation is seen as one of these, mechanisms of action against the growing trends in inequality. So could you go into a little bit about the kind of preceding trends of inequality and why this is such a problem for society and why it's such a drain on society?
Sure. So we have seen a dramatic explosion of inequality, mostly since around 1980 in the global north. And that has led to a massive increase of labor income inequality, of capital income, I believe is still pretty unequal, but that's mostly untouched. And then overall income inequality is very, very high. And that has led to wealth inequality being very, very high. I believe that by some estimates, wealth inequality is higher today than it was in the worst years before the Great Depression, which was followed by the massive destruction of estates in World War I, and a huge redistribution of wealth after Social Democrats rose into power in World War II. So we're seeing wealth that's somewhat unprecedented. You have to go back to, I believe it's the silent generation, to see anything comparable. And that has pretty big impacts, I think, on our politics, on our quality of life, and actually on the social antagonisms that we face in society, just like this cat. I guess the trend is pretty stark. It's something like I can go pull up the SIA's numbers if you'd like to edit this in, but it's something like the top 1% own 50% of the wealth in the United States, and the top 0.0001%, 8 families, own as much as the bottom 20%, some absurd numbers. This is clearly not a productive use of resources, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very frightening. This is a frightening trend in inequality. And before we even started this, you were explaining, your kind of twofold argument for why you think, inequality is, such a net drain on our Western society. Do you mind retreading on those arguments you were making earlier?
Sure. So I think there's two arguments. One is very mainstream. It's something that even mainstream econ, neoclassical stuff accepts. It's this idea of marginal utility of income, that, $1 to a homeless person is worth many times more than $1 to someone like Jeff Bezos, who is unbelievably wealthy, because he already has income, he already has wealth. And so giving him an additional dollar doesn't really change his life very much. In contrast, taking someone out of poverty, or someone who's homeless, and putting them in a house, giving them $20,000 a year, enormously changes their life. And there's literally studies on housing interventions like that, and it turns out it literally does get people off the streets permanently. People literally get trapped in poverty. So the idea is that, in general, even neoclassical economics, even mainstream economics would agree that inequality is bad in some sense. But the mainstream econ would say that inequality is worth it because the rich make good investment decisions and they cause economic growth, and so that benefits everyone in the long run. And so that kind of gets to, I guess, the second argument, which is about morality, for one, and a little bit about efficiency, too. Oh my fucking god, all of the pets are causing problems. You can't see it at all, but my cat keeps trying to climb on top of me, and it is extremely distracting. That's why I keep moving away from the microphone.
Where is Merrick when you need to wrangle these pets?
Basically, yes. Yeah, she's still coming home from work. Well, actually, that relates to the second point, is this idea of freedom, because if you're poor, you
Yeah.
aren't meaningfully free. And so, for example, Merritt has to work a job. She's not free to be at home right now. That seems like a very trivial freedom, but in a very meaningful sense, you aren't able to exercise your freedoms if you don't have the money and the time and the ability to actually exercise them. It's this idea that the SocDem philosopher Isaiah Berlin first put forward of positive freedom that was expanded a little bit by the analytical Marxian philosopher G.A. Cohen, that freedom is only real if you have the means to access and utilize it. And so, in a very real way, someone who doesn't have the income to go somewhere doesn't really have their freedom to go there. The park might exist, just a block or two away from you. But if you have to go to work every single day, if the days off are spent doing errands, if they're taking care of children, the park does not really exist for you in a meaningful way. Your freedom is very meaningfully constrained by your ability to spend your time and your money and what resources you have to do so. So this is sort of the human flourishing argument, that in general, giving people income helps them flourish, and it helps people who have a lot less income flourish a hell of a lot more. So not only is this like an economic efficiency argument, it's like, I don't know, having access to the basic goods of being like a human being sort of argument. That doesn't really address the efficiency argument, but I think it's a pretty compelling moral argument from G.A. Cohen, that equality
so I
is
guess
generally preferable.
the right to be free is basically meaningless if you don't have the actual means to kind of exercise that, right? If you're really just trapped into your labor and then the kind of unpaid labor you do outside of your job too, and you're not in any meaningful sense freer than somebody who has the means to kind of avoid that, basically, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think we look at like the lives of the rich and what do they do with their time? Well, they just lounge around and they have fun, like the vast majority of them, except for weird business people like Bezos who actually enjoys doing like Amazon. Um, the vast majority of them, when they have a lot of money, they choose to use it for leisure. But most of us
Yeah.
who don't have that freedom can't. Like you can't choose to be to hold a bunch of leisure unless you also choose to be
Yeah.
homeless or choose to not have
Yeah.
expenses.
Unless you want to like live like Diogenes
So
or something. But yeah, okay. So we've established that there's a alarming trend of inequality. Inequality is generally kind of failure of the state. So people propose wealth taxation as a mechanism of action against this. Right. We've seen in the 2020 primaries, we've seen people like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders propose a wealth tax. Thomas Piketty wrote his seminal magnum opus Capital on a wealth tax. So could you explain the kind of idea of the wealth tax and how it would kind of help curb the trends in inequality?
sure. So I think there's two questions here. First is, what is wealth tax? And I think it's fairly simple when you break it down. Much like an income tax, you would estimate the value of someone's wealth. You would break it down into different brackets. So wealth from $0 to X dollars gets taxed at this percent. From X dollars to Y dollars gets taxed at that percent, and so on, just like income. And so most of the proposals that we've seen, like by people like Sanders and Warren, generally tax wealth at 0% up until like, I don't know, $100 million or $1 billion or so, which we'll, I guess, get back to in a little bit. But that part is fairly simple. The more complicated part is how you value the wealth. And I guess, again, that's a mechanism question, which we'll get to in a little bit. The question of why we need a wealth tax, I think I'm of the opinion that if the economy was functioning optimally, like if we had the social structures and the government structures like taxation and so on set up right way, we would not need a wealth tax. I see it as kind of like a break, that wealth inequality is so extreme, it's so unbelievably extreme, that we can't just tax flows of income, capital income and labor income. We have to actually tax the stock of wealth. Because, like I said, for example, something like 8% of families own as much as, I don't know, like the bottom 20% of the United States. The top 1% own as much as the bottom 50%. And that's absurd. And again, there's moral arguments against it. I think it distorts our politics, and I don't think it's economically optimal. So the idea is we need it because other parts of our social safety nets and of our tax system have failed. That if in the first place we had more redistributive mechanisms, we wouldn't need to tax wealth like we do. But we are here now, so we have to. That's why I guess I think it's necessary, not just good.
That's a pretty cogent argument for it. So obviously, you think this is a good idea. This is something that we need to do to kind of ameliorate the inequality that we see. So I guess my question now more is there's been implementations of wealth taxes across European countries. Can you talk me through some of these projects and what you see as the failures and successes of these projects? Like, what have we learned from it in terms of how we go about implementing a wealth tax?
Sure. So this kind of gets to the question of how do we actually mechanically do a wealth tax? If you're, in stock Twitter, I'm sure you've seen a lot of like mechanism discussions about welfare, right? It matters how you design the administrative burdens. And this is also true of a wealth tax. The basic problem that economists, I believe Emmanuel Saez, Saez, pointed to for most European wealth taxes, and the reason why so many European wealth taxes fell away is that they had way too broad a base. And usually SocDems really like broad bases. We
Broaden
like,
the base, raise
not
the
we,
rates.
sorry,
Yeah.
y'all. Yes. So like socialists usually like it too. SocDems usually like broad bases. The problem for the wealth tax is twofold. One, it makes it a lot harder to administer because now you're chasing smaller amounts of wealth in people whose wealth is less
Hmm.
liquid. Because the more you get towards like really massive wealth shares, the more you're getting people who own
Hmm.
stocks and who own lots of more liquid, easily valuable assets. And you're getting wealth so large that it comes into a second problem. Basically, the idea of the aggrieved millionaire, I believe Saez
Hmm.
calls it, or the like aggrieved landowner. So the classic case is, let's imagine you've got a family farm worth $10
Hmm.
million, and this is the only asset you got, and you got it through
Hmm.
inheritance. It is hard for you to pay taxes on that without selling it or taking a loan of
Hmm.
some kind. And so it makes you real pissy
Hmm.
about it. And so this is the general idea for like people inheriting houses. If you inherit a house and in 1 year you have to pay like a tax bill of $300,000, but you don't have those
Hmm.
savings, you end up having to sell the house or take out a loan. And people
Yeah.
really hate that. And so it encourages people who have wealth, who are already very politically active and organized, to really fight
Hmm.
against these taxes, was, I guess, one of the arguments from a political perspective. One of the main differences you see in American style wealth taxes is a really high bottom tax bracket. So I think Warren's started at a
Yeah.
billion, but I could be wrong. It might be
Hmm.
100 million. And I think Sanders started
So
at
I guess
100
we're looking
million.
at specific types of wealth that we want to tax, and not broaden the net more narrow the kind of have like more parochial view of it. So I think the main thing would be equities, right, in North America, and I think what is it, like 86% of equities owned by 10% of the population. So yeah, I guess yeah, I'm interested in talking more about how we can kind of tax equities.
Yeah. So I guess that's the other part of the mechanism design is like, what's the wealth? How do you value it? How do you tax it?
Yeah.
Um, and so the answer to like how existing wealth taxes in European countries have done so is generally with a fairly broad
Hmm.
brush. I think, for example, later you want to talk about Norway's wealth
Yeah.
tax, and it includes, I want to say, basically all assets except privately held
Hmm.
companies, which is one of the reasons that your study had the results it
Yeah.
did, I think. And so, like, it's a fairly broad
Hmm.
brush. And so, I think when you look at taxes like Warren's and Sanders, I believe it's also a fairly broad brush,
Yeah.
but I don't know that it's that form. It's actually been like a year or something since I've looked
Hmm.
at it. So, what is wealth is generally just like net worth in a
Yeah.
very broad sense. Um, and this especially isn't a big deal if you start at like $100 million, because once you get to that amount of wealth, you don't really care if it's stored in someone's paintings or their
Yeah.
mommy's old estate or whatever, because they have
Yeah.
enough money, they can take the hit.
And
um, and
yeah.
it's a very small group of people. It's like
Yeah, and I
0.001%
mean,
of the
to
population.
me, the liquidity questions aren't even that important because I'd like to see something like you have a wealth tax, and instead of they don't have to liquidate their assets, but it could be placed on if, specifically talking about equities, it could be given to the state and placed in some kind of social wealth fund maybe. So I don't see the necessity to kind of have a liquid market for. These equities, I guess, even it makes sense for when you buy into like private equity that you can't necessarily put a valuation on as a government. If that could just be handed over to the government and put in a social wealth fund, I think that'd be cool.
I mean, it would be a dream, I guess, if you could sell some of the assets and it'd be like, I don't know, wealth fundized or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Um, but I guess that actually gets to the heart of the other really big mechanism question, which is how do you figure out how much wealth someone's got? And so, well, so the mechanism question that you were asking about was, or rather that I brought up, was that we need to figure out how much wealth someone has to figure out how much taxes they need to pay. And the classic reason this has been another hard problem and why some tax agencies avoid doing so is because for illiquid assets, think stuff like land you own or property, think stuff like private companies which aren't on a market, think art. These things are illiquid, and it's hard to be like, oh, well, I have an intuitive answer for how much those things should be valued. This is one of the big distinctions between like the wealth tax and like a land value tax, because with the land value tax, you can estimate the value of land by the value of land around it. There is no around for wealth. Like there is no around for a painting of the Mona Lisa or a privately held company that's the only firm of its type in a town or something. And so the solution to this problem, it has historically been in the United States, just tax capital income, because instead of looking at the stock, which is hard to evaluate, we look at the flow when you actually sell the company. One of the proposals by, I want to say it was Sanders, but I could be wrong, was to use a modified form of this flow-based accounting. I think that Saez talked about it too. It's this idea that essentially the government would strongly encourage you to pay taxes on your wealth as if you were going to pay capital income taxes, capital gain taxes rather, so that at the end of that, you don't pay a higher rate of tax. In short, you're paying forward the cost of what your tax would be so that you don't pay a higher tax at the end. This also gives the government money now rather than money at the time when the wealth is actually sold, which tends to be better because money now is worth more than money later.
That's the bread and butter of finance, right?
So, I mean, we can get really into the weeds on that, but I guess the basic overall premise is that at the very broad scopes, it's easier to evaluate wealth when it's only a few people and it's a huge amount of wealth, and they're people who already have accounting and books. And that's the ones that are being targeted by US taxes. So that's the mechanism design question 2, basically, like what wealth and how much wealth. Question 3 is how do you stop people from hiding it? Because again, a distinction between the land value tax and the wealth tax is that you can hide your wealth. You can undervalue a painting. You can shift your assets. It's possible to hide it. And so this is not true for, say, like wealth and for income. Generally, like income, unless it's done in cash, is tied to some electronic purchase. But wealth, there is no like flow that the government can see. No one gave you $10 at that moment for the wealth you owned. So the main proposal here, I guess by Saez, is Saez thinks that the rate of capital hiding is fairly low. Less than 1% of assets are hidden. So the taxation rate is roughly approximately what it should be. So that's not too big a deal, they think, based on some studies from Norway and from Switzerland, I believe. Where the estimated rate of tax hiding was like 0.5% and 0.5%. And then there was one study in like Colombia, which had it like 16.5%. But the obvious question is, whether the tax system of Colombia is as up to snuff as is Switzerland's and Norway's. So probably having a good public infrastructure, well-funded IRS and so on is key to that. The other part of this that they suggest is an exit tax. One of the problems with European wealth taxes was tax competition. So one of the things that countries literally did is offer tax breaks on their wealth taxes for rich people to move to their country, because that way they get a new rich tax like hike, basically a new like source of taxes. This is a lot simpler in the United States, which has fiscal unity. So we could just do a federal wealth tax. It doesn't matter where you go in the United States, you're paying it. In fact, it doesn't even matter if you leave the United States, you have to renounce your citizenship or you still pay taxes to the United States. This is called the global wealth tax principle, and it's a little bit Orwellian, but I do quite love it in this instance. So the basic idea, in addition to this, is right now the U.S. has a exit tax. You have to pay a tax on the wealth if you leave your country. Saez's basic suggestion and Warren's basic suggestion is just increase that exit tax to 40%. So if you leave the country, you'll pay a very steep rate on your wealth, which strongly encourages people to keep their wealth in the United States.
I heard that. Yeah. Sorry.
I guess I should also add one. No, absolutely. One final thing, it's hard to measure capital flight of the very wealthy because the assets are the things that you're trying to track, and that's hard to do. But for income, we have done studies on this, and there's basically no evidence that income tax rates affect where high income people live. Millionaires aren't all fleeing to Texas. on average, there's a 0% effect from
Yeah.
higher or lower taxes on millionaires. So, in short, I'm trying to say the risk of capital hiding and of capital flight is
Yeah.
fairly low. It's there, but it's small and low, and
Yeah.
the gains
No,
are
I think because
fairly
you
enormous.
basically got to the next question, which is, the kind of opprobrium to wealth taxation is that, capital is more elastic than labor. So generally you'll see capital move around. But you're saying there's actual mechanisms, especially in North America, to prevent that sort of capital flight when you step up the taxation rate for for exiting the country up to like 40%. So they're incentivized to pay right now, basically. So, I mean, you're saying that capital flight, not that much of an issue in North America.
I'm sure it
Mm-hmm.
would be an issue for some people, like especially in the America with like a crazy libertarian cult. Some people
Yeah.
would leave just because fuck taxes. But like the idea is that on average, most people won't. Most companies don't think in that way where they're trying to like eke the most out of like the tiniest bit of wealth, unless it's fairly easy to do and they don't have to like literally
Mm-hmm.
move all of their assets to another
Mm-hmm.
country. So it's easier
Yeah.
to do that with like financial assets, but harder to do when the wealth tax is on
Yeah.
like every asset you
Yeah.
own, including like physical
With like, I guess
plants.
with the illiquidity of the
Yeah.
asset, like, I
So
mean, how do you move your land from here to Europe? I guess, yeah, that's um,
and it's probably easier again for people with financial wealth to move it.
mhm.
So that is like I think there is some risk there, but mostly the solution there has to be the same solution as to tax havens in general, is some form of global tax
Yeah.
system. Um, so I think that the solution to that is more complicated than just how you do a wealth
Hmm.
tax. An exit tax is probably a fairly good like impromptu
Yeah.
stopgap.
But yeah, there needs to be some kind of long-term oversight and long-term planning for a more global approach to wealth taxation, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. So I guess now I want to get like this is a really interesting part for me. Is that you and James Medlock are some of the people that I see talk about the efficiency and productivity gains that we see from wealth taxation. And recently I read your Twitter thread. You say that the argument for wealth taxes are similar to the argument for land value taxes, which is an interesting train of thought that I hadn't really had before. So what is your argument for the efficiency gains from wealth taxation, and how do you think this kind of relates to the so-called perfect tax, which is the land value tax?
So people call land value tax the perfect tax because we believe it increases productivity,
Mm-hmm.
even if the funds are like burned, because it encourages people to use land more productively.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is land value tax taxes the land underneath the property. It does not increase when you build stuff atop the property. So
Mm-hmm.
it encourages people to do exactly that. Instead of letting land sit idle and making money off of the change of like how much that land is valued based on property values or whatever, it encourages you to actually do something with it or sell it to someone who will. So the argument for, I think, for wealth taxes rather, is somewhat similar. In short, the land value tax, you are taxing a stock, and by doing that tax, you tend to shift it from people who have a low flow, who have low profit from the land, to people who have a high flow, who have a high profit from the land. In the same way, a wealth tax, because it taxes the stock of wealth, tends to shift the overall distribution of wealth away from those who have a low flow, who don't have highly profitable investments, to those who have a high flow, highly profitable investments. And the argument for that being a good thing is that probably, hopefully, more profitable investments are also societally more useful. If
Mm-hmm.
you live in a functioning society where hopefully we've internalized a lot of costs and have a reasonably functioning like regulatory system and are moving continuously towards socialism, which is a bit of an ask, but like hopefully more profit means more social utility.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, I mean, more productive firms, obviously would generate, greater profit margin. This is good for even in the future if a government wants to kind of, tax this profit base, right?
Oh my God.
Dogs again.
Oh. Okay. My cat stepped on the mute button. Could you please repeat that?
What did I say? Yeah. I was saying, yeah, the more productive firm is, the higher the profit margin is, and this is generally good for governments who want to tax these corporations too, or implement some kind of social wealth fund. So I think, yeah, that's a good argument for the kind of efficiency gains.
Well, so I guess I wanted to relate this to another argument that some
Yeah,
SocDems
sure.
have, which is the idea of solidarity wages. So Sweden had this idea that within each type of labor, so like welders, the wages of every firm in that sector would be fixed at a constant wage plus experience or something, but basically a constant wage
Mm-hmm.
in that
Yeah.
sector. And so this had an effect, which I think is maybe counterintuitive to some lefties, or at least it was to me, that it encourages more productive firms by giving them more profit. And so usually lefties aren't like, I want to give firms more profit. The mechanism is fairly simple. If the wages are constant for any worker of a given type, then firms that use those workers less productively get less profit per worker, but firms that use those workers more productively get more profit per worker. And because the wages are fixed, the less productive firms can't just lower wages, and the more productive firms can't just raise wages. So what this actually does is shift profit from low productivity to high productivity firms. There's a similar argument around the minimum wage. And so in all of these cases, it's sort of an argument that you're trying to encourage productive use of assets. And so the wealth tax isn't quite that simple. I know we've talked about a bunch of these good taxes because the wealth tax is in an indirect way a capital gains tax. The way you can think about it is, if you're investing and eventually you get up to $100 million or whatever, and you start paying the wealth tax, then this means that every time you get more money, you're paying more tax on more income. So it's just like, the fact that you pay income tax is a disincentive in theory to get more income. In practice, I think that a lot of post-Keynesians would say, a lot of these investors aren't like, they're going to invest because they want more money. And the behavioral reasons for Elon Musk to invest more money, or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, people who just have unfathomable amounts of wealth are not actually tied to their well-being. Elon Musk is already the most pampered person on earth, I'm sure, where he could be if he wanted. So it's not like it's magically increasing their utility because they're already way beyond what the average person experiences, what beyond humans can experience, I think. So they're investing it just because that's what they do. It's this idea that high income and high wealth people just have a high propensity to save. So this sort of argument is important because it says that even when you tax high wealth people, they'll still save their money. And that's important because in mainstream econ, if you lower the rate of savings, it makes it harder to get new investments. That makes it harder to make new, say, innovative firms, and that in turn will hurt growth. Now, this too has been critiqued by, if you want to Google the savings glut, basically there's this idea that we have way too much fucking savings right now. And so the problem with new investments is not that we have too few savings, but too few profitable investments. So I guess that's the final efficiency argument for wealth taxes. And I'll try and summarize this at the end because I know it's been a little bit of a spiel.
No, I think we've touched on some really good concepts there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, continue.
You're cutting off. You're interjecting for 10 seconds in my 5-minute rant.
No, don't worry. You're the guest here, so I want to speak as little as possible.
So if the wealth tax is also paired with some sort of redistribution of wealth, if you aren't just taxing it and burning the money, if you're actually giving it back out to people, even if you gave it out as a flat tax or a flat benefit to every person, that would still tend to distribute money from the rich to the poor, and the poor tend to spend more of their money as a percent of income than do the rich. So this would tend to increase consumption. And so some have argued that this is a bad thing, because, it's going to be profligate consumption or whatever. But most post-Keynesians and a lot of modern economists would think that is very much not the case. More consumption helps increase profitability of firms because it means that firms can sell more goods at higher prices. And so that makes it possible to do yet more investment. One of the classical paradoxes pointed out by post-Keynesians as early as Joan Robinson is that the more consumption you have, the more investment you can have, because that enables you to do businesses that meet that consumption, essentially. There's a line by Robinson, which is something like, capitalists earn what they consume and consume what they earn. Because if they don't spend anything, then they don't have any businesses to sate needs with. So that was a long-winded way of saying that wealth taxes that redistribute money can increase aggregate demand, aggregate consumption, and that can in turn spur investment by increasing profitability, which is a good thing. So that's just an argument for, generic welfare programs that give the poor more money. But it is true of wealth taxes in general.
No, I'm glad. So I think there's three things that we touched on in the past couple of minutes. The first one was you were talking about the kind of solidaristic wage policy in Sweden, and that's a really interesting example because if I'm remembering correctly, so these high productivity firms would have something called high windfall profits, and then so I think Meidner's kind of response to the late 70s was the wage earner funds, where these high productivity firms would be forced to put X% of their profits into control the state, thereby transferring ownership of these large kind of stocks of equity into the hands of the state. And so this is a wealth tax could be a kind of stepping stone to that. I think the second one is that I think I like the post Keynesian view of that, and if I'm remembering, because I'm not really that well read on post Keynesianism, but I think one of the arguments is that firms most importantly care about power and growth more than they do about these kind of short-term impediments like wealth taxation. And as long as a firm can borrow enough to keep growing, I think that's what they'll keep doing. And this third concept, if I'm remembering this correctly, isn't it that it's investment driven and not savings driven?
That's a point on which I'm still, I think, in like the neoclassical mindset, and I would terribly butcher the post-Keynesian one if I tried to give it. But I do believe that generally post-Keynesians tend to think that it's profit and investment rather than savings driving investment. Closer to the Marxian side of things, which is profit drives investment, than the neoclassical side, which is savings allow investment. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. No, these, I'm glad we touched on these three disciplines, because I want to have someone on in the future to talk about post-Keynesian economics, because it's like very interesting.
I mean, you should see if you could talk to Cartesian Otter, because they've done a lot more of the reading than I have.
I've been trying to schedule an interview with them, but we'll try to hammer down the details. Cartesian Otter, if you're listening to this, we'd love to have you on. But anyway, yeah, so okay, I guess to the eighth question. So what we've just talked about right here seems to be at least a little bit kind of empirically, I don't like say proven, but maybe like verified to a tiny extent. In Norway, it seems that wealth taxes not only have had not had a negative effect on employment, but it's increased aggregate productivity by forcing the burden of the tax onto less productive entrepreneurs who don't efficiently allocate their capital, making it kind of more advantageous than a capital income tax. So what do you make of this? The kind of study that was done, because I know that you're familiar with it a little bit.
I read what is it? Let me pull this up. Was it like Bergstrom or something? 2020. It's some B Norwegian name. I guess the first thing is, I think the study is limited because it only looked at small and medium firms, and in particular, one of the things that I guess that's important, and I'll explain in a moment. And they did find, as you say, that there was no employment loss. There was, in fact, an employment gain from wealth taxes. But part of the reason there was an employment gain is because employers could reinvest wealth into the firm and have it be taxed at a lower rate than their private wealth, essentially. And so this isn't like an argument that's interesting as it relates to like capital income taxes and corporate taxes. Is maybe if you encourage firms to reinvest, then they will reinvest more. But the counter argument to this is, for example, with the Norwegian study, that it's limited to privately held firms, and it doesn't apply to publicly held firms because of a quirk in Norwegian law, that privately held assets, I believe, are either not subject to or subject to half the tax rate of publicly listed firms. So like if something's traded on the S&P, it would be taxed at like the full wealth tax rate, but if it's privately held, then it'd be taxed at like half that or zero. And so it's not clear whether this result would hold for the entirety of the Norwegian economy. I guess is the thing I'm not sure, especially because the vast majority of corporations are publicly listed in the United States anyway. I don't know if that's true in Norway.
Yeah, I have no idea about the Norwegian tax system, but I guess okay. So I guess this is kind of like an impromptu question, but all of this has got me thinking. So if you could pitch your kind of perfect wealth tax proposal right now, like how would you structure it?
I mean, I think the basic answers from the mechanism design are a really high floor, so that you don't get a lot of people with low income. You don't get a politically aggrieved base against it. It's not a very highly visible tax, and it's mostly targeted at people who have mostly liquid assets, and they're easier to evaluate, and you get a lot more money from said valuation. You want a really high exit tax. You want really strong international tax compliance laws and electronic bank information laws so that people can't just hide their assets. So that's kind of the what wealth, how do we find it? And then I mean, I kind of don't like the idea of tax brackets. I wish we could just do like a straight progressive, like you pay X times like 1.X or whatever. That was terrible butchering, but like I wish it could just be a straight line. But That's beside the topic. I understand that tax brackets are really simple to legislate. So like something
Yeah.
like I think Sanders' wealth tax, which got up to like 8% over like $10 billion, I think, which I know sounds really high. But one thing we didn't get to earlier in this podcast, which maybe we should like do and then clip back in or something, is like
Sure. Yeah. We can go for it right now. Yeah.
basically what the question is like, what would the effect of a wealth tax be on inequality? And that one I didn't really answer. But again, looking to the work of Zuckman and Saez, they noted that if we had had a wealth tax of 10%, which they call a confiscatory wealth tax, it is higher than anything the world has ever seen, right? If we had had that, then inequality in the United States in terms of wealth would actually be lower today than it was in 1980. So when you get to reasonably high wealth taxes, it has like a truly enormous effect on turning back inequality, even without affecting the underlying inequality of labor incomes or of capital versus labor incomes. Just the wealth tax is enough to like destroy the massive wealth accumulated at the very, very top end.
Yeah, and you know, as we talked about before, there's like kind of moral and ethical reasons to combat this kind of rising trend inequality, and why it's just such let's say an insidious rot on our,
Basically,
current
yes.
society.
I don't know.
So I guess
I think it's
yeah,
scary to
yeah,
live in a world where very few people have. If we think that wealth is essentially a form of power, and like it obviously is, then it's scary to live in a world where such a few people have so much power. It's the reason that we don't like dictatorships and we like democracy. It's the reason we like workplace democracy and not workplace dictatorships. The same reason we shouldn't want wealth dictatorships, so to speak. We should want wealth to be more widely distributed so that no person can control the economy. I don't know. I don't want to have to be like, what if Elon Musk ran for president? Would he fucking win? I have no fucking idea, and that scares me.
I mean, who knows? He could tweet his way to the presidency, like I guess the last president. So I guess anything is possible. Yeah, because I mean, wealth also it's this. It also bleeds into the kind of political capacity of individuals either, right? Because the kind of power that wealth buys into the political system is quite frightening. That 10% of society can make decisions for the 90% just because of the inordinate amount of wealth that they hold. That's really troubling for a democracy.
I mean, so I recently there was a study that came out that used the causal mechanism to evaluate the effects of Citizens United on people's political beliefs, and I believe that their result was that people's beliefs shifted like 5% to the right on like corporate taxation issues after Citizens United, like pretty substantially. Like for comparison, I believe it's something like whether Fox News existed or didn't would be like a 6% difference in whether people are Republican or not, right? So this is like a very large effect on people's opinions. And I've shitted on, sorry, I have critiqued studies before, like Gillen's and Page 2014, because I think that they have some weaknesses. But the overall finding of the vast majority of research into basically how democracy functions in the United States is that the wealthy have more political sway than the poor do. One of the follow-up studies to Gillen's and Page found that Democrats and Republicans aren't both driven by the wealthy. It's that they're driven by the wealthy within their own party, which for Dems I quite like because the wealthy tend to be like center left, which is meh, but they are like socially far left, which is great. So at least we got one of the two. But for Republicans, it's horrifying because they're socially far right and economically far right. And so it's part of the reason we've seen political polarization is that the elites are pulling the parties. The elites are very polarized in their views. And so they're pulling the rest of us with them. And by elites, I mean like the very wealthy. It's not like some shadowy cabal. It's literally just rich people.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's really frightening. And so, I mean, I guess this is kind of besides the point. It's not even really related to wealth tax, but how do we combat this in like popular discourse? Because I feel like there's so much brain rot, especially in our current discourse. You can't really pitch things like this without people having the reflexive, like, oh, these people are the ones that are, creating the wealth and kind of increasing the size of the pie for all of us. Like, oh, we want to tax them. This is bad for all of us. Like, how do we in popular discourse kind of counter that? Besides these kind of, these academic arguments, they're good. I love them. But like, how do we fight them, in the media and on Twitter or
I guess
wherever?
to draw an analogy, when talking about like workplace ownership, it's really good in my experience to focus on democracy, on how if you had more input into your workplace, you could help run it better, on how the boss doesn't always make well justified decisions and more collaborative decision making could help that. If you're appealing to like a more libertarian audience where they tend to to give a lot more credit to boss decisions than workers. But I guess for stuff like wealth taxes, for taxation in general, the argument has to be twofold. Um, One, I guess, is just an appeal to the economic research as you see it, and that will work for some people. Um, but the other, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
is a combination of moral arguments about where wealth comes from, in that, ANCAPs will sometimes say, that, like, I earned my wealth. You have no right to take it from me. But the classic response to this is that you did not earn that wealth alone. There was a whole society around you making it possible for you to earn that wealth. Were there no roads, you would not have been able to go to work, and you would have gotten precisely zero income. And so you extend this down the line, if
Mm-hmm.
you hadn't gotten an education, if you hadn't been like protected by police, and so on. Very basic, like liberal principles, even. Like you don't have to go as far left as like
Mm-hmm.
socialism to say that NCAPs are stupid, obviously. But basically, the idea
Mm-hmm.
is that income is social. It is socially determined to some degree. And so the idea that you alone created it, or Elon Musk or whatever alone created it, is absurd. And the idea that Elon Musk should be able to get, say, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, what is it, like $300 billion out of that, when he's almost certainly not put $300 billion in, seems absurd too. Um, I believe
Mm-hmm.
Brunig calls this the executive compensation argument. I could be wrong. I can go try and find that link afterwards. Basically, the idea is that
Yeah.
it's almost certainly not true that chief executives genuinely provide as much value as they are compensated. But even if it were true, this does not
Yeah.
mean that they should be paid that much, because you produce more value than you are paid. And yet, these same people do not see that
Mm-hmm.
as like a moral problem. So the idea that
Yeah.
Elon Musk should be paid as much value, even if he somehow did create $300 billion value through his exemplary management, which I don't know, from his tweeting
Mm-hmm.
and like accusations of intensive racial bias at his factories, seems not to be the case. Um,
Yeah. And yeah, his blood
yeah,
money
I mean,
from his family too as well.
there's a whole litany of stuff we could go over. I mean, my hot take is that Elon Musk is probably like the better of the billionaires, because at least he's spending his money on things that advance technology. Like at least he's literally such a fucking redditor
Yeah.
that he's like science epic XD and funding things that are actually helping humanity instead of like the Koch brothers, where they're like
Yeah.
money epic XD and they fucking destroy our political system.
And yeah, just for a very small specific portion of the population to have better outcomes, that they're already disproportionately, they're so much better off, and they want to have a little bit, they want to have a little bit better off, while the rest of the fucking 90% suffers. Yeah, I think you're
I
absolutely
guess
right.
if I could give one more answer to that, I know I'm just pounding this one.
Yeah.
Jacobin
No, go ahead.
recently put out an article based on some empirical research on what appeals to working class voters. And one of their big findings there was that appeals against the elites and for equality are actually very persuasive on their own. Um, it is
Mm-hmm.
one of the fortunate things, I guess, is that humans have a natural drive towards some level of like egalitarian mindedness and equality mindedness. And so, really appealing to
Mm-hmm.
that and pointing out that there are these elites that are trying to stop you from getting access to the good life, by their political actions. And not, again, not some shadowy cabal. They're just following their best interests. They're just funding candidates who want to screw you over. That kind of stuff really works. It's part of why
Mm-hmm.
Sanders did much better than
Yeah.
people thought he would. So Jacobin has a really neat
Mm-hmm.
article on the types of messaging that work to drive economic left policies home to working class voters.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So that's all the questions I had on wealth taxation. I just want to. This is completely unrelated, but I want to bring up something cool that happened today. I just want to get a quick opinion on it. So, recently today, the Prime Minister of India finally capitulated to a year long farmers protests. This was millions of farmers that got together under like, well, I think one of the biggest labor movements we'd have recently. So I think I just want to get your quick opinion what you think about this huge victory. For
So
the
I have
international
not
left
read
now.
into that. Like I said, I've been working all day today. I need to read about Rittenhouse and then the Indian protests.
Yeah, yeah.
I think literally the only thing I saw on Twitter was some take that like the farmers were actually just well organized like plutocrats, and that doesn't sound right, but I don't know. Um, in general,
No,
I like the
absolutely
idea
not.
of the
No.
masses being organized. It sometimes is true that the masses can be organized in a way that fucks over other people, like police unions. But
Yeah.
in general, I
Yeah,
would
of
hope
course.
it's good, and I hope that, I guess the hope would be that even if this individual protest did not lead to like good outcomes for the whole of Indian society, that like labor organization would tend to reduce
Hmm.
inequality in Indian society and push India back towards like a more social democratic governance. Ideally, some sort of dismantling of what is it like, the red tape Raj or something. I'm totally forgetting it.
Yeah, something. Yeah, it's the so I mean, India tried to do it was basically the best of both worlds. They tried to centrally plan their industrial base, but have a consumer goods market, but that was like heavily bureaucratic. Both of them kind of failed because you took the worst parts of both, I guess. You took the central planning from socialism, and then you restricted capitalism, and then it was just a bad outcome. We were bankrupt in the early '90s. We had to get a bunch of loans from the IMF and neoliberalize our economy.
I guess one of the big contrasts I would draw is between like the Indian very failed development state and like the Taiwanese, South Korean, and now Chinese and Vietnamese development states,
Hmm.
where their really big focus is on like demand management and encouraging industries to cooperate. This is sort of like the point of like Matsukudo's entrepreneurial state arguments that like the state can have a real impact on improving companies' productivity and boosting like demand and boosting production, and that has payoffs.
Hmm.
Whereas like there genuinely is a problem with like red tape and regulation, and that it does fuck over the ability of people. Like as a market socialist, if markets are just like bound by regulation, people will be competing on their ability to like do paperwork and handle bureaucrats and pay bribes, not on their ability to produce
Yeah,
high quality products. Like it,
yeah.
I don't know. We can all hate on
Yeah,
red
no, I
tape.
think that's a fair. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the license fraud really killed what could have been a cool, fledgling country growing into an actual because it was. I think it was one of the most cogent examples of like post World War II kind of democratic leftism in the developing world. Like it was like when it started, it was like a really it's like a titan. Like I cannot understate how much of a titanic democratic project this was because India was never a country before this. It was never a unified set of states in the same way that it was. But to like put that together and turn that into like a functioning democracy is just immensely awe-inducing. I'm very sad that we failed in the economic front, but I think that's one thing I can appreciate that is that we did the democracy part right at the start. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, so I know there was one anecdotal story which I thought was interesting. It's not related to wealth taxes, but I guess it's kind of related to intellectual property
Hmm.
rights. It was in my class on economic development, I believe, where we read about India was trying to produce steel natively because apparently they didn't have like a large steel plant, at
No,
least
yeah, we didn't have any.
in like the 40s or 50s or
Yeah.
something. Um, and so three companies contracted with it. One was from the Soviet
Hmm.
Union, one was from Germany, and one was from the United States and the UK. And the Soviet Union one was built using worse technology, but finished on time and under budget. And the main reason why is that they literally shipped the Indian workers into the Soviet Union, had them work in an identical plant designed by the same guy under like similar bosses,
Hmm.
learn the same techniques for a year or something, and then ship them back. And they just started work.
That's super cool.
And in contrast, the German facility and the American facility had these like pampered workers who hated the local Indians, deeply racist. And so they finished both over time and over budget, but they did use more advanced technologies because they came from the
Yeah.
West where they had them. And so in the end, I think the German and American plants ended up producing more steel, but the Soviet one I thought was like a small testament to the powers of not having intellectual property and being able to have companies cooperate at a deeper level, a sort of Matsukudo style argument.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Anyway, yeah, I guess that brings us to the end of the conversation. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I know you've been really busy. I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for coming on, taking time today.
I'm not busy after this. I just don't want to take your time away from your event. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, I gotta like.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
Continue.
no, after you.
I cut you. No, I cut you off. Yeah, you gotta give us the official end of the night goodbye.
We need to get you to become like a debate podcast, not like a debate streamer.
I
so
can't
you learn
do
how
it.
to fucking cut people off. Oh my
I
god.
can't do it. No, it feels mean.
Yeah, it feels mean the first 20 times. And then you know what happens? Someone says something so fucking pissy and stupid that you've got to cut him off. It like rises up a red tide in you and you'll fucking feel it.
Well, luckily, you haven't said anything stupid today. So anyway, thank you so much for coming.